Are electrolytes a massive scam? Today's guest is Dr. Alan McCubbin. Alan is an accredited sports dietitian, former president of Sports Dietitians Australia, and he completed his PhD at Monash University, where he asked the question, what role does sodium really play when it comes to performance?
If everyone believes that electrolytes are important, what's the commercial advantage in testing it to possibly show otherwise?
And his answer is incredibly important for all athletes and nutrition practitioners to hear.
If sodium, and there's a small group of circumstances where sodium may help improve hydration, and you improve the hydration, that might help performance.
We discuss hydration and at what point dehydration affects performance. We discuss the tight interplay between sodium and hydration in the body, and we answer the question, how much sodium do I really need to optimize my hydration levels and my performance? This is a great chat, so let's get to it. All right, welcome back to another episode of Performance That Matters. This is an episode I have been incredibly excited to have. We are joined by Dr. Alan McCubbin. Alan, thanks so much for coming on.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Alan, you have some of the most interesting research that I've read in sports nutrition, and personally, it has helped me immensely with my practice with our UFC fighters, our fighters at every level in every sport, to be honest, and then also with our ultra endurance guys. I feel like when I first read your modeling work, it was like a aha moment where I finally had, oh my God, like finally there's something here that's explaining what we're seeing in practice. Alan, how did you get going in this hydration sodium field? It's a bit of an interesting way to spend your time in a PhD. How did it all come about?
Yeah, and it's been an interesting story, a bit of an interesting journey too. I was working as a practitioner, as I've been a sports dietitian for 20 years now, and the first 10 of that was just purely as a practitioner. I was working in the hospital sector as well as privately with athletes, and I sort of ended up more down the endurance space just because of the sort of clientele I was seeing. And then as a result of that, I sort of built out a bunch of spreadsheets that I used to sort of help me do planning for race nutrition. So, we'd have all the products loaded into there. So they'd say I'd have one of these gels and this much of that drink, and I'd put it all in there and how many hours, and I could say, you're going to get this many grams of carbs per hour, etc. And so I was using that for just sort of assisting me to do meal plans for people for races. And as part of that, we looked at the carbs, we looked at the fluid, and there was a little section in the spreadsheet for sodium. And I put that in there because we had the information for the products, but there were really no guidelines to tell us how much sodium should we replace. Sweat testing was up and running at that stage, but there was really nothing to tell you what to do with the results. So, I had that in there, but didn't really do anything with it. And occasionally clients would sort of say, well, what about the sodium? Like, you've got that on the screen there, I can see it, but what do you want to recommend? And I'm like, don't know. There's no guidelines around this, so we really don't know what to do. So fast forward a few years, I ended up through a variety of circumstances, starting at Monash University here in Melbourne, and got into a position where they needed someone to do some teaching, and offered a PhD alongside the teaching role. So really fortunate to get that. And the PhD, unlike a lot of PhDs where there's a project already specified, where it's like you're coming in to do this project, this was one where it was open-ended. It was just like, we need someone to do the teaching on the sports nutrition side, and there's a PhD in it for them. And so it was sort of walking in day one saying, well, there's a PhD here, what do you want to do? Which is very unusual in that kind of position to be able to choose your own topic. And so for me, I sort of thought back, well, what are the big gaps in our knowledge? What are the things that we don't really know about and are relevant to, my work as a practitioner? And I sort of thought back to the spreadsheet and the sodium and thought, oh, that's an area that we don't have good answers for. Maybe we should try and get some answers for that. So yeah, that's kind of how the PhD came about. So that started in 2016. Finished that thankfully in 2019 before COVID kicked off, because that played havoc with a lot of researchers, particularly lab-based researchers. So yeah, finished that off in 2019. Was lucky enough to get a grant through the Ultra Sports Science Foundation to sort of continue on research on that theme in ultra endurance athletes. That study took the better part of 5 years because of the COVID interruptions to get people recruited for that study, get it all done and published. And then there was obviously a gap in the middle there with all the lockdowns and things where there wasn't a lot of lab research you could do. And that led to that modeling paper that you mentioned before. So we had a Sports Dietitians Australia conference in 2021. It was a virtual conference, obviously, with all the lockdowns, and I didn't have any new research to present. And so I knew of this equation of predicting the change in blood sodium concentration, before to after exercise, given different inputs and outputs. Um, and equations are just algebra, and the equation was predicting the final blood sodium concentration given the inputs and outputs of sodium and water. But I thought, well, it's just algebra. We can rearrange the equation. So let's flip it around and put the sodium at the front because that's actually going to tell us, well, how much sodium do you need to achieve a particular outcome. And so that became that modeling paper. So it was originally just a little sort of exercise I did to get a poster at the conference because I didn't have anything else to present. And it went up, and the presentation went up, and I started getting text messages from people, pretty prominent people in the field saying, "Is this published? When are you publishing it?" And I'm like, well, I guess I've got to publish it now. And I'm glad I did because it's, probably of all the stuff I've published in my career, it's the one that's had the most interest. And it started off just as a thought experiment and something to do during lockdown.
Yeah, a little make at home poster just changed the whole landscape of sports nutrition and electrolytes.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny how these things work out.
Alan, going back to choosing this as an area of research, like you said, when you're working with your endurance athletes or any athletes, if they're pretty on top of their nutrition, hydration and sodium is a conversation that you have with them pretty early on. They're all aware of it, but it's kind of funny that, like you said, there's not a lot of research or there wasn't a lot of, well, were a lot of good guidelines for it. Why do you think that is? Why is there that gap in research for what we suggest for sodium?
Yeah, it's something I've been pondering for the last 10 years as well. It's interesting. There's a lot of research in perfecting the measurement of sodium losses, and that goes back probably 20 plus years. Gatorade have been probably at the forefront of that, to give them credit. Um, but for all the work they've done at perfecting, quote unquote, the sweat testing process, there was really nothing in terms of, well, once you finish that test and you get your data, what do you do with it? Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. You can come up with all sorts of conspiracy theories of, they do all this testing, but they don't, you know, if everyone believes that electrolytes are important, what's the commercial advantage in testing it to possibly show otherwise? Again, I don't know if that's the motivation. That's just I guess, the devil's advocate view of it, I suppose. But other than that, yeah, I really don't know. It's not an area that's had a lot of interest over the years. It still doesn't really. I'm probably the only one who's really doing much research actively in this area. A few PhD students in the UK actually are now starting to do that, and most of them have reached out to me and sort of picked up on the stuff that I've been doing, which is great to see that that's sort of carrying on. And so hopefully we'll get more data around that, and that will help. I think also, some of it is difficult, and obviously we'll get into some of the more ultra endurance stuff. That is a very difficult area to do good research in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I want to do, Alan, with this is make this as logical and easy for the followers to listen along because, as you and I both know, when we start talking about hydration and sodium, it can get kind of complex, especially when we talk about the physiology and then we talk about, okay, how does this even apply to performance? And it can really get quite mind bending. So, let's start all the way back and let's talk about just hydration and let's talk about what you qualify as hydrated, and then at what point is the body deemed dehydrated?
Yeah, it's a good question and surprisingly simple but difficult to answer at the same time. I guess the simple one would be, someone is, their kidney function is normal, they're producing a normal amount of urine at the normal kind of concentration. But we need to remember that urine is not a measurement of hydration status. It's a measurement of what the kidneys are doing in response to hydration status to keep things in balance. So just because you've got concentrated urine doesn't necessarily mean you're dehydrated. It just means that the kidneys are working a bit harder to maintain good hydration. The problem, I guess, with defining hydration is everyone's different shapes and sizes, different amount of percentage body fat versus fat-free mass, and they have different amounts of water in them. And so we can't say, hydrated is, when water makes up 60% of your body weight, because that's different in males and females. It's different depending on percentage body fat and all of those kind of things. So There was a paper, I think it's 2007 off the top of my head, which was sort of around measuring hydration, a review of it, and it's sort of the title of the paper is The Elusive Gold Standard, and it sort of talks to the fact that there is no one single measure that you can say definitively, yes, this definitely means the person is hydrated or not. I guess what we have to think about then is what are the different components that make up potentially hydration or the different ways we could think about it. So what the obvious one is a total amount of water within a human body, total body water. Again, there's no cutoff to say this is perfect hydration and this isn't. Then you can look at, say, blood volume or plasma volume. You can look at how concentrated the different dissolvable particles are within the blood. So that's our plasma osmolality, and that's how the kidneys tend to respond, how the brain responds in terms of our thirst mechanism and so on. And so that's how the body kind of draws on feedback to try and maintain hydration is through that method. But none of those in isolation are perfect measures of being able to say you're definitely hydrated or you're not. Also, most of those involve expensive or invasive lab techniques. So it's not like you can just rock up one day and say, well, let's measure my total body water accurately anyway. And so then it's, well, what's a practical thing we can do instead to try and figure all of this out? And the model that has been used over the last few years, and thankfully it's starting to get a bit more research because for a very long time it was more or less just a theoretical model, was this WUT model. So it looks at weight, urine color, and thirst. And so it's like a Venn diagram. So basically says, well, if your body weight has dropped more than 1% from the day before or when you know to be fairly well hydrated, there's a reasonable chance that you're not well hydrated. If your urine color is sort of a darker yellow color, again, reasonable chance that you're not well hydrated because obviously the kidneys are working harder. They're making more concentrated urine, so they're trying to conserve water. And then if you're thirsty, again, that's the brain's response to that higher plasma osmolality. And so if you've got any one of these in isolation, it could be due to other factors. If you've got two of those happening together, it's more likely that you're dehydrated. And if you've got all three together, it's very likely that you're dehydrated. There has been a couple of recent papers looking at this in a bit more detail, suggesting that probably the weight and the thirst are the better predictors of those three compared to urine color. Um, but I think just as a general rule, that's still a reasonable model. And a lot of people don't weigh themselves every day. And there's a lot of people that probably it's not in their best interests from a mental health point of view to weigh themselves every day. So, you may not necessarily want to do that, but urine color and thirst might give you at least a reasonable idea of what that is. And then in terms of, what is dehydration, obviously it's when total body water has declined. Does it decline from the inside of the cells, from the blood volume, or the outside of the cells, or a combination of the two? That'll obviously vary depending on the circumstances, but usually it's a combination of both. And generally speaking, traditionally we've used a metric of about 2% of body weight. So if you've lost more than about 2% of your body weight from where you started, and that body weight loss is purely from fluid, then there's a good chance that you're reasonably well dehydrated, and then you can get into the weeds of well, what stage does performance get adversely affected and things like that.
Yeah. And I'm sure the audience who's listening to that is probably sitting there thinking, man, I thought this was just an easy chat about hydration, and hydration is a bit more complex, but it is. Hydration is very
Mm.
complex. One of the things we talk about a lot, Alan, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the fighting scene too much. There's a big promotion over in Asia called One Championship, and they introduced hydration testing in order to help prevent weight cutting. And I've spent
Yeah.
the better part of a decade strategically dehydrating my athletes and then rehydrating them. And I openly admit it that that test is so incredibly easy to cheat because all you need to do is understand some simple physiology. And a lot of the conversation when we talk about how do you even define hydration, people go, it's just your urine color. And this is always the thought experiment we use with them. We go, the same way that we cheat that test, you can go home right now and I can prove to you that urine isn't always reliable. Go get 1 liter of water, drink it, go into a sauna, sit in there for an hour, you'll lose probably 3+% of your body weight. You're obviously going to feel very dehydrated. Now go to the bathroom and pee. Just hold your bladder while you're in the sauna. So you're going to come out in that situation. You're going to feel exceptionally dehydrated. You're going to be exceptionally thirsty because your brain thinks you're dehydrated. Then you're going to go to the bathroom and you're going to urinate and you're going to look at it and go, oh, that doesn't look like I'm dehydrated. And it's because hydration is really complex. And I love this little segue into the 2% body weight, because if you think hydration is complex just for the everyday person sitting down listening to this podcast, wait until we talk about it for athletes and then what effect it has on performance. Alan, you touched on the 2% body weight. Can we start there and can we just talk about, okay, if we lose 2% body weight and we're saying, okay, we've sweat out, you've weighed yourself, you're 2% down in your body weight from sweating, where does this 2% number come from?
Yeah, it's a good question. Historically, a lot of the hydration research has been based around this premise. Okay, well, we get athletes, we do what's called a crossover trial. So they do one trial, they go away for a week or two, they come back and do the other trial. And the advantage then is the participants are their own controls, essentially. So they do both conditions rather than the traditional, if you think about a traditional drug trial, which might be much bigger, but you take one drug or the other drug, or the placebo or the active drug. So you're in one group or the other. You don't generally cross over. So these are generally crossover trials, and what happens is the participants come into the lab relatively well hydrated, exercise for a period of time, usually in pretty warm conditions, and they vary the amount of fluid that they give them. And the traditional way that this had been done for probably 30, 40 years was that in one group, they were given enough water to pretty much completely replace all of their sweat losses. So almost, we talked about 2% body mass loss. We're talking like 0 to maybe 0.5% body mass loss. So, probably not something that would be reflective of the real world for a start. And then the other group, they would just not allow them to drink at all. And so, depending on the combination of exercise intensity, duration, the temperature they're doing it in, they probably lose somewhere from 2 to 3% of their body weight, by the end of it. And then they do a performance test at the end and measure the difference. And every single time, pretty much, you'd see that the group that lost more than 2% of their body weight would have worse performance at the end compared to the group when they were, or compared to the same people when they were drinking enough water to replace all of that. And so that's where the 2% rule came from, if you like. Most of that was done in cycling. That's the other thing to consider compared to running. Running is obviously a weight-bearing sport, so you have to carry your weight with you, and it changes the energy cost of running, the more weight you have to carry. Whereas cycling is a weight-supported sport. You're sitting on a seat, and it's just about power output. Yes, it's obviously relative to body weight when you start going uphill, so that is a consideration, but probably doesn't affect things quite as much as it would with running. So that's another consideration there. Now, the problem with those studies is, well, there's a lot of problems with those studies, but probably the main thing that you'd say is they're not placebo controlled. You know when you're drinking lots of fluid, you know when you're not allowed to drink. It's very clear, and it would seem pretty obvious that that would affect performance from a placebo effect or a psychological point of view. And if you drew an analogy and said if you did a caffeine study where you gave people caffeine tablets in one, or caffeine powder or something in one trial, and then literally gave them nothing in another trial, and you tried to go and get that study published, you'd get laughed back to your university or wherever you came from. No one would publish that study because of the lack of placebo control. And yet for decades, that's exactly what happened with hydration, because it's, how do you blind the amount of fluid that someone's consumed? It's only been in the last 10 years. We were talking off air about Dr. Lewis James, and he's one of the two groups of researchers that have done this, is they've actually used nasogastric feeding tubes to get around this. So they actually put in a nasogastric tube, the same thing that people have in hospitals when they're unconscious or can't safely chew and swallow for whatever reason. And then they feed the water through the tube directly into the stomach. So it bypasses the mouth. They can feed it from behind the person. So while they're riding their bike, the fluid's being passed through behind them, behind a curtain or something where they can't see it. And so the participants actually don't know how much fluid is being delivered. So now you've got proper sort of placebo control for this. And in some of those studies, they'll also give them ice chips or just a tiny amount of water to drink that's the same in both. And so now you can set up genuine differences in hydration. And from those studies, the result actually from the original studies does actually seem to hold. So once you lose more than 2% body weight, performance definitely does seem to be impaired. I guess the question has then been, well, what about at a more mild level of dehydration? 1 to 2% in that range, can performance be impaired? And what those studies basically show is that probably the placebo effect would have more effect there than the hydration effect on performance in those sort of smaller ranges. But over 2%, blinded or unblinded, you pretty much see the same thing regardless. So yeah, I think that's sort of moved things forward. Most of those are still cycling just because it's easier to do in the lab. So we still need to do more in running. We still need to do more in females. Most of those studies are primarily men, not exclusively, but the majority of them are more males than females. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of unanswered questions still. And I think the final thing that I don't think anyone's really talking about is if you look at the performance tests in those studies, they're generally short term in nature. And that's because when you're in the lab and you want people to give a genuine physical effort, um, you probably don't want to keep it to more than about half an hour, or they start losing interest, get distracted, get bored, whatever, and they're not giving a genuine effort like they would on race day in a marathon or triathlon or whatever it is. And so the exercise intensity is relatively high because it's, well, how far or how fast can you go in about half an hour or less? So sometimes they're only 15 minutes long, these performance tests. And so even there's one study now published that looks at 5 hours of exercise and the fluid replacement over 5 hours, but then the performance test was a time trial that only lasted half an hour. So you're going at this sort of lower intensity for 5 hours, but then you have to increase the intensity for the performance test, which is fine for some sports like pro cycling, where that's exactly kind of the pattern of the event. But for marathon, Ironman, ultra running, those kind of events where it's much more of a long continuous effort rather than go at a easier pace for 5 hours and then kick up a gear for the last half hour or hour of the event, we actually don't have studies of that kind of nature. So it's difficult to say, certainly no more than 2 hours of exercise to say. And again, it's very difficult to do that properly in a lab. Like for people to go in a lab and give you a 5 hour continuous effort at their best performance twice within a short period of time, and to do that without any kind of distractions or other effects is incredibly difficult to do. So it's not done because people are incompetent or don't know what they're doing. It's done because it's incredibly difficult to do what we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, we appreciate that the 2%, there will be a deficit in performance, but I'm sure you and I both know, just from a practical standpoint, both being involved in the sports ourselves, you in BMX, me in ultra running, you working with a cascade of different athletes, you know that in practice, when these guys are going for 6, 12, 18, they almost always get more dehydrated than just the 2%, right? Do we
Yep.
have cutoffs in terms of, okay, at 2%, there is this marked decrease in your performance. At 5%, there is this marked decrease in performance. And at 10%, there is this marked decrease. And I'll preface this, the reason I want to ask this is because I've spent, like I said, the last decade strategically dehydrating some of the best fighters in the world. And I think there's a lot of misconfusion. There's confusion about, okay, well, I just can't get the body more dehydrated than 2%. You absolutely can. We regularly get the body 10 to 12 to 15% dehydrated with our fighters, but you have to remember they're sitting passively in a sauna, they're passively in a bathtub. We're not going to ask them, hey, do a 20-minute time trial. And I'll divulge this information, Alan, and this is the first time I've ever publicly said it, but I'd say 6 years ago, when I was trying to understand this field with our fighters, we got a doctor to come on board, we got physiotherapists, strength conditioning, and we had a facility where we could do weight cutting with our fighters. And then we had testing facilities next door, and we had a medical staff, and we were able to convince 3 of our elite national level fighters to come on board and go, hey, you know what? Say if we were to do some performance testing when you were 10% dehydrated right after you made weight, and we could standardize this testing with what we've done in your fight camp, what does that look like? And funny enough, this would never get ethics approval in any university, I would imagine. But seeing that, what impact that had on their performance was so insightful for me, because that's what sparked me to go, oh my God, wow. Yeah, at this level, this is insane. There's no way you would ever send an athlete with your name attached to it at that level dehydration. You've got to make sure they get back And then seeing athletes that weren't that dehydrated, what happened to their performance metrics when you tested them straight at that time. Oh my God, no way am I sending this athlete out when it's attached to me. Is
Mm.
there any numbers that you can attach, Alan? Say if they get 2% dehydration, it gets thrown around 20% decrease in performance. If there's a 5%, there's this percentage, or if 10%. Do you have any numbers like that?
Not easily, and the reason is that it depends on what the performance is. And it's not just like strength versus endurance. That's probably too simplistic. Like even with endurance, as I said before, you can do performance tests that are a maximum effort of up to sort of 15 minutes or half an hour. You can do what's called a time to exhaustion test, which is where you just go at a particular pace for as long as you can until you can't maintain the pace anymore. Those tests you generally see much bigger differences, like 10 or 15% differences compared to traditional time trial, which is like how fast can you do a certain amount of work or a certain cover a certain distance. There you're seeing differences of maybe 2 to 4% in terms of performance. Um, then there's a whole bunch of other factors that you can add in terms of, well, you're looking at reaction time, or you're looking at technique. There's been examples in cricket, for example, where they've looked at bowling accuracy and things like that. There has been some, I think, some weight regain studies in combat sport athletes. It's not my area of expertise. You probably know more about those than I do. But bearing in mind that's sort of total weight regain, whether it's water, whether it's glycogen, whether it's gut content. So it's probably a little bit jumbled up in there in terms of isolating just the hydration part of that. Um, Obviously, once the more you lose, probably the worse it's going to get. That's probably not going to be a surprise to anyone. Um, once you start to lose, 5 to 10%, you're into probably the clinically dehydrated range where you're thinking about health as much as you are performance. In ultra running, it's pretty rare that people get to that stage unless something has gone horribly wrong, obviously. Or you've gone hiking and got lost for days and ran out of water or something like that. So it's not common for endurance athletes to ever get to that level of dehydration. It probably has been more common in the past just because fluid intake had been less emphasized. So Haile Gebrselassie, for example, when he broke the world marathon record in, was it 2008, 2009? I think he broke it twice around that period. Um, he's been reported to have lost about 8% of his body weight in one of those races, presumably drinking not zero, but not far off that particularly compared to his sweat rate. Berlin Marathon's not particularly warm. Um, and then the final thing I'd add to this, and something that we really don't know about, and again, talking about Lewis James, I know this is an area of interest for him. We don't know if the point where performance becomes impaired is different in different athletes. So if you and I both go do performance tests, do you get impaired at 1.5% and I get impaired at 3% or vice versa? Is there any way to predict that? Currently, no. Can people train to quote unquote better tolerate dehydration and improve that kind of threshold? We don't know. None of that research has been done.
Yeah, and just going back to this point, I guess what I'm trying to highlight is that a lot of people think, oh, hydration is just drinking water and this is so simple. And I want to really make it clear that even the concept of hydration itself is quite convoluted. And then you try to add this performance metric and get some data and quantify, okay, how much of a performance decrement are we getting from dehydration? And at least from what I'm hearing you say, Alan, is we really don't know at this point. Is that correct?
Yeah, like I think we could say with reasonable confidence that probably somewhere between 1.5% and 2.5% performance for sort of higher intensity endurance stuff starts to become impaired for most people. Um, but that cutoff is probably different for different people. And I wouldn't think of it as a cutoff. It's not like 1.9% you're fine and 2.1% things are going terrible. It's going to be a continuum. It's more of a fader rather than an on-off switch.
Yeah, perfect. So let's wrap that up for hydration. And I think we've set the scene very, very well for hydration. Let's move on and let's talk about sodium. And can you tell us, Alan, what does the research currently say when we talk about sodium and performance?
Very little. Um, there's really not a lot out there. So my PhD didn't focus specifically on the performance question, but we did a literature review of that as part of the PhD, more as kind of a little side project to keep me entertained while the other stuff was happening. Um, it was specific to endurance performance, so I'll put that caveat on it first of all. But we tried to find every published paper that had ever looked at sodium replacement and performance, and we only found, I think it was five or six papers, I can't remember now, that had ever looked at that in a way that sort of met our criteria for that study. Several of those papers had methodological issues where I'm like, oh, I don't really trust the result of that. One of them, for example, had people, it was a rarely an all-female study, but they had these female athletes running around at outdoor athletics track and measuring performance, but they did it on obviously on different days because it was a crossover trial, and some days were as cool as 2 degrees Celsius and some as warm as 20 degrees Celsius. So of course the temperature just completely overrode any effect of the sodium or the hydration that was going on, and you know the results are fairly meaningless in the end. Um, the other studies, a couple of them were during real life events. One was during an Ironman, one during a half Ironman, where sodium performance wasn't the key question, but they kind of measured it because they could. Um, and so they gave competitors capsules, either placebo capsules or salt capsules. And you could argue in one sense that that's the best study to do it in a real life competition to see what happens in the real world. The problem is that the real world is messy, obviously, with triathlon in particular, where you've got transitions where, transition time affects your final result, but it's nothing to do with physical performance. You can have, your shoelace comes untied or you drop your chain or whatever. And so there's some complicating factors in there. One of those studies found an effect, and it's in fact the only study out of all the ones that we found that showed any effect was the half Ironman. The Ironman showed no effect. There's a couple of others. One was an outdoor cycling time trial, but in fairly consistent conditions, no effect there. And then one lab study that found no effect. So yeah, overall we don't see an effect of sodium. Obviously we'll talk about as we go through maybe the relationship between sodium and hydration, because I think what I've sort of gleaned from those studies and some of my own work is probably that sodium doesn't have an independent effect on performance. In other words, just taking sodium isn't going to help you from a performance point of view. But if sodium, and there's a small group of circumstances where sodium may help improve hydration, and you improve the hydration, that might help performance so sodium may have an indirect effect in certain scenarios.
Let's run with that train of thought while we're on it, Alan. What do you mean by that? Because, and even in your research, right, you've looked and said to athletes, hey, do you think that this sodium is helping you out? And correct me if I'm wrong, in your research, you found that some of them really were on the camp that, yeah, if I have this sodium, it helps me. Others were kind of like, oh, I don't know if it really does anything. And you see that a lot in practice, right? They're interested in it and they're like, I don't really know what it does. And it probably reflects that us as the practitioners and where you're sitting as the academics and researchers, there's not a lot of good research to lean on. Is that a fair assessment, Alan, of that research that you did? That what is the perception amongst athletes?
Yeah. It was quite polarized, I think we found. And that's true of hydration as well. And that reflects, I think, we talked about the lack of guidelines in this area. And so when there's a lack of evidence or guidelines, there's a knowledge gap or vacuum, and something is going to rush in and fill that vacuum if it's not filled with science. And so, it's been kind of filled with two schools of thought. One is the one pushed, people would argue, by companies that make electrolyte products. That of course they're important. You should use lots of these products because they help you, and so that's been one predominant view. And then the other one was kind of the counterculture view of that, and that had been led by some researchers, not necessarily based on a lot of sodium research, some, but not a huge amount. Was drink to thirst, you don't need sodium. You're going to give yourselves hypernatremia. The sports drink companies are fooling you. That real kind of counterculture that kicked off when Twitter kicked off, frankly, in the late 2000s. That's when it sort of hit its peak, is in the early 2000s, around the time that low carb mania was at its peak as well. Um, I think neither of those views really do us a service. They're both kind of extreme views. But you're right. When we surveyed endurance and ultra endurance athletes, it was very polarized. They were either very convinced that sodium was super important, or they were very convinced that it was a waste of time. I would say it was probably, I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say about two-thirds were convinced it was important and one-third thought it was useless, roughly.
Yeah, excellent. And you see that a lot in practice, right? And I'm sure you'd agree, Alan, when you talk to athletes, some are just hyper obsessed. I need to get this. I've heard about the sweat testing. I've done my sweat test. I need to replace every little thing, which we'll absolutely go into. But I think the best way to set up this next conversation, which leads us into the modeling work and into the really good, juicy stuff, can you expand on what you meant when you said you don't think that sodium isn't has an independent effect on performance, but it may impact your hydration status, which may affect performance. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So this is really about how sodium works within the body from a physiological point of view, which probably is going to get to the modeling data you were talking about before. So most of the sodium in our body exists within what we call our extracellular fluid. So this is basically the water that exists in our body, but is not inside our cells. So it's the water that sits surrounding the cells called the interstitial fluid and the water within our bloodstream, our plasma volume I mentioned before. And the regulation of water ins and outs from the body is based primarily, as I said before, on the plasma osmolality, which is how um, concentrated or diluted all those dissolvable particles within our blood are, because they pass through some receptors in the brain. They pick up that. The more dilute that blood is, so it's not very has a lot of water in it relative to those particles. It's going to tell us to pee more. So if we drink a lot, it'll dilute all of that stuff. Our brain will signal to the kidneys via antidiuretic hormone, pee out all that extra fluid, and we'll pee some pretty clear, dilute urine. And we won't feel thirsty. The opposite happens when we become dehydrated. So when we sweat during exercise, we lose water, we lose sodium, and a few other things in pretty small quantities, but they're the main two. And when we lose both of those, we actually retain some of the sodium. Our sweat glands have a mechanism to actually capture some of that sodium before it leaves the body, but it doesn't do that for water. And that makes perfect sense because with water, you want it to leave the body onto the skin because the whole purpose of sweating is to cool you down. You want that water on your skin surface because until it evaporates off, it's not actually helping you. So, yes, we're losing water. Yes, we're losing sodium, but we're losing proportionally more water than sodium, if that makes sense. And so the upshot of that is that when you go out and exercise, if you don't eat or drink anything, as you become dehydrated, your blood becomes saltier or more concentrated. So you're losing water, you're losing sodium, but because you're losing more of the water, you become more concentrated. That signals to your brain to make you more thirsty. It signals to your kidneys to conserve water. And so there's this relationship because sodium, of all of those dissolvable particles that make up the osmolality, sodium has probably the biggest influence out of all of those. Some of the others have some influence, but sodium has the majority influence. And so this relationship between sodium and water is really important because it signals to the brain and then therefore the kidneys what to do in terms of how much we're peeing out and how thirsty, like our actual drive to want to drink or not want to drink. And so I guess that's where this role of sodium having an indirect impact on hydration comes in because, you know, that what's that episode from Seinfeld? Like these pretzels are making me thirsty. So if you have a lot of salt but no water, you tend to get thirsty because you're making your blood saltier, and therefore more concentrated. The reverse is true. If you drink a whole bunch of water, you get less thirsty, you tend to pee out the excess. And so having the sodium there in some situations may increase that thirst response and actually encourage people to drink more. There also may be a psychological component that, oh, this drink just tastes good. I want to drink more of it, which has got nothing to do with physiology in the sense of, blood sodium or anything. It's just a, mouth, tongue, brain kind of response. That hasn't really been investigated in too much detail. Um, but there are, a bunch of studies that would suggest that if you take in more sodium, you get more thirsty and you want to drink more, but it's not a universal finding. So we did a big 5-hour sodium replacement study. We didn't see that in our study. So I think my conclusion from all of that, and it's probably a very long way to say, in some circumstances, replacing sodium during exercise encourages you to drink more. Whether it's a physiological effect or a psychological effect is hard to say at this stage. For some people, it may make no difference to that at all. But if it does encourage you to drink more, and you genuinely need to drink more, then theoretically you could see that that's a bridge to better performance.
Can we touch on this topic that you spoke about here, Alan, where you talk about if we're drinking more, our blood will get diluted and the sodium in our blood will get diluted, which will cause a cascade of effects for our body to go, hey, we're diluting the sodium in our blood. So there's all these signals going, let's get rid of some of that fluid. And then that's going to bring this back into balance. And the reason I want to ask this is because in a lot of the research and a lot of the conversation we have around hydration and sodium, it's to prevent this condition called hyponatremia. Could you spend a little bit of time, Alan? Just tell us what hyponatremia is and then why is it such a concern? And just as a segue, I want this to lead into a conversation, say, in these longer endurance events. Should we be focusing on hyponatremia, hypernatremia? Do they interplay? Is there a flux between them? But just first and foremost, can you just give us a definition, hyponatremia, and why is it that a lot of the guidelines that we have don't drink so much water because we don't want this thing?
Yep. So at its most simple, hyponatremia, the hypo means low, the nat means sodium, and emia means blood. So basically low blood sodium. So the classic definition of hyponatremia is basically when the concentration of sodium in your blood drops below what's considered kind of normal from a clinical point of view. So most people use the definition of 135 millimoles per liter. So if you go and have a blood test, your sodium result will generally be in millimoles per liter rather than milligrams. Once you drop below sort of 130, you probably start to see some of the symptoms of this. So generally speaking, what happens with hyponatremia or what causes hyponatremia is over drinking water. And then therefore diluting the sodium. So it's not necessarily lack of sodium because, as I said before, if we go out and do a whole bunch of exercise and not drink at all, actually our blood sodium goes up, not down. So for it to go down without excessive water is, some people say it's theoretically impossible. Some people say that they claim to have captured that and measured it. Um, I think we're not 100% sure on that, but it's probably very uncommon, I would say, in that scenario. What's much more common is the blood sodium goes low because we drank a lot of plain water and it diluted things. Now, the body's normal response to that is what I just described before. The kidneys will get activated, you'll just pee out all that excess fluid and it'll bring things back into balance. If that doesn't happen for some reason, and sometimes during exercise, particularly sort of endurance, ultra endurance exercise, either because we drank so much water we've overwhelmed the kidney's capacity to get rid of the excess, or there's some situations where the hormonal response from the brain to the kidneys isn't doing what it's supposed to, then that fluid can accumulate in the body. And what will happen, I mentioned before that there's water inside and outside the cells. And the sodium doesn't just flow freely between the two, but the water does. And so you have an environment within the cells where you have the osmolality inside the cell, so how concentrated or not the water is compared to the dissolvable bits, and then the same on the outside of the cells. And the water wants to move to keep those in balance. So if we start diluting our blood and that'll flow into our interstitial fluid that surrounds the cells, we make the osmolality there low, it's higher on the inside of the cells. And so that water is going to move to the inside of our cells and expand the volume of our cells. If the volume of the cells expands too much, that's where we get into the dangerous territory of hyponatremia. So I think in some ways, the word hyponatremia, not that it's technically misleading, but I guess it kind of alludes to what we measure in the blood, but it's not actually the bit that's dangerous. The dangerous part is the cells expanding as a result of all of this fluid moving into the cells. So theoretically, you can have and this wouldn't really happen in an exercise context, but maybe in a medical context, you could have hyponatremia where there's not a fluid overload, it's just lack of sodium, usually because something else has gone wrong with the way that the kidneys deal with sodium. And as a result of that, you technically have hyponatremia, but you don't have this shift of fluid into the cells and you don't have the same problems. So the main problems that you get with hyponatremia is when you get the swelling of those cells, particularly it can happen around the lungs and you get short of breath. But the really dangerous one and what's considered the real risk with hyponatremia is when you get those cells in the brain starting to expand. Because obviously your skull is a fixed case to hold the brain in. The brain doesn't have room to expand as it swells like most other parts of the body do. And so when it expands, it's going to get pressure put on it. And so you can get damage occurring. And so at the most extreme with hypernatremia, you can have people's, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, confusion, seizures, loss of consciousness, and there have been some reported deaths. Now, this is not hugely common, but it has happened.
And Alan, just to summarize, what are the conditions, say for someone running a marathon, that they would be at risk of hyponatremia?
Yeah. So hyponatremia, as I said, is going to be mostly from fluid overload. So it's going to be in situations where you've got ample access to fluid, and you're encouraged to drink a lot of it. But at the same time, you're not losing a lot of fluid. So it's generally going to be cooler conditions, maybe smaller, slower athletes. They're less likely to sweat as much. So they're losing less fluid. Maybe the slower athletes maybe have more access to water and can tolerate drinking it better because they're not working at a, 2 hour marathon pace where you're going that fast. It's just hard to swallow the water without choking on it at that speed when you're breathing that heavily. So if you've got your 4 or 5 hour marathon runners that are going pretty slow, they're not sweating a lot because they're not going that quick, but also they're more likely to stop and fill up with water. They can swallow it. They sort of take their time with it. So they're probably the higher risk athletes of hyponatremia. Generally see it less commonly in the more elite end of the field.
And no shade to our 4 5 hour marathon listeners.
No, of
You guys are
course.
absolutely killing it to
Yeah, yeah.
keep at it. But it's a good point, right, Alan? And I'll come back to it. But I just firstly want to contrast this. And I know you said not a lot of data in this area. And the reason I'm interested in this because there is a case study. I'm not sure if you've seen this in the weight cutting world where we've done an observational case study on someone who's dehydrated 14% of their body weight, which is an extreme amount. And we saw cases of hypernatremia, which is the opposite of what we're talking about, Alan. Personally, in my practice, when I've found this somewhat relevant to talk about is maybe not so much in a 4 hour marathon, but if we get these guys that are doing 36-hour races, we're heading off, our team's heading to Cocodona in Arizona, which is a 5 day race. There's a long, long period of time, and it's not uncommon for ultra endurance runners to go, hey, you know what? I had a terrible stretch here. I couldn't take any fluid or food in for 8 hours. That's very common to see. Can you just explain what the other end of that, not the hyponatremia, but the hypernatremia, what that is?
Yeah. So hyper is basically the opposite of hypo. So hyper, high, and then natremia, so high blood sodium. So this is classically what you see with dehydration, whether it's exercise induced or it's clinical dehydration. Someone got lost in the bush for a week or something with no access to water. That's what's going to happen. So basically, again, you lose water through sweating and through urine. You lose sodium through sweating as well. You lose proportionally less sodium than water. So as you exercise, and this happens to everyone, but just to a milder extent, not to the point where you're worried about hypernatremia. But if you go out and exercise now, you go for a 1 or 2 hour run and don't drink or eat anything, your blood sodium will go up because you're losing more water proportional to the sodium. Now, where it becomes into the dangerous territory, I guess, is as it goes up too far and you become more extremely dehydrated. And, with 14% body mass loss, I'd not be surprised if someone had a blood sodium concentration. We said the normal range is sort of 135 to 145. I'd expect someone there to be probably in the high 150s. Wouldn't surprise me if you took a blood sample, if you could actually get it out of them, because the blood would be pretty thick and concentrated by that stage. So yeah, that's basically what hyponatremia is. Hypernatremia, sorry, it's the opposite of hyponatremia. And I guess what we're trying to achieve in some of these ultra endurance sports is to find the balance between the two. So we don't want people to become severely dehydrated because that's going to be the number one cause of hypernatremia. Theoretically, they could do that if they just took a whole bunch of salt capsules or tablets or something like that. They could also cause hyponatremia if it was massively in excess of what they're losing. Um, I think generally speaking, your body's pretty good at preventing that from happening. If you down that many capsules, you usually end up vomiting. Although, ironically, that probably makes you more dehydrated as well. So, at least you don't absorb all of that sodium because you're vomiting up some of the capsules, maybe. But yeah, so that's hypernatremia. Then you've got hyponatremia at the other end. Both of those can happen in ultra endurance sports because you can drink too much for your needs, particularly in those longer events where the exercise intensity is obviously going to be lower than it is in a marathon. So your sweat rate is lower. You're not producing as much body heat. Some of it's overnight where the conditions are much cooler as well. And so, yeah, there is a risk of over drinking in those scenarios. But as you said, if you start to get gut issues and things like that, and you're not taking in any fluid, then it can go the other way also. So it's trying to find the balance between those two. And that's done by the combination of water and sodium and the relationship between those two. And that's probably the key thing here is that you can't think of either of those two in isolation. They work together.
And just to summarize this point, Alan, because I think this is important, and especially if there's practitioners, students, and very astute athletes who are listening to this, because a lot of the research, like we said earlier, that will look at this, like you mentioned, Gabrielle Celesi, a lot of it is looking at very elite level marathon runners. And as you alluded to a bit earlier, when you're running a 2 hour to 2:10 to 2:20 marathon, heck, I run a 3:30 marathon and I struggle to stop and get cups of water to get it in. Very, very difficult for that person to encounter these problems. But when we talk about, like you said, the 4 or 5 hour guy that, yeah, you've given it a really good crack, you've put in some good training, it just opens up because of the time, the physiology, the way that you're going to be ingesting. It opens up these situations where, hey, you know what, there's going to be some problems. And then on the other end of that, if we get into the ultra endurance space, and I think it's important to think about, especially now that most young people are buying a David Goggins book, listening to it once, never running a marathon, going, you know what, I'm skipping all the way through that. I'm going straight to a 100 miler. There's these different conditions that we need to appreciate that do exist based on your physiology, based on how you sweat, based on how you take in fluid, and based on what happens during the race that, for the most part, we don't really talk about. We just tend to focus on this hyponatremia piece because it's what we talk about a lot in the literature with the marathon runners. Do you have any thoughts on that, Alan?
Yeah, um, you're right. I guess people tend to focus on what they're exposed to, and for a long time, the argument was that they were too exposed to messages that you're going to be dehydrated, you need to drink more, 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 and that resulted in the pendulum going too far in the opposite direction, and then a spate of cases of hyponatremia, and the pendulum's almost swung completely in the other direction now, where everyone's so scared of hypernatremia. I think it's stopped now, but a lot of races used to like weigh people at various stages along the event to make sure they weren't gaining weight because of fluid overload and things like that. Um, yeah, it does happen, but it's not that common. And by just understanding the basics of how water and sodium work, how you can try and figure out how much you're actually losing, and then being sensible about that, and trying to work out, I guess, how your body is giving you feedback about how you're going as well, and listening to that feedback, and not just blindly going out there and saying, I need this many mils per hour, come hell or high water, whether it's 5 degrees or 45 degrees. Um, you know, I think a lot of it is just common sense at the end, but it's kind of thinking through, well, why is this common sense? And once people understand that, they're like, oh, okay. And then, cases of both of those are actually not that common.
Yeah, and just summarizing this, Alan, and correct me here. So the hyponatremia, we're defining this as a low blood sodium, and that can occur when we're drinking quite a lot, when we've got the opportunity to drink, say if we're stopping at these little drink stops or aid stations and we can put in, and it could possibly also be a case that you're drinking a lot of water with not enough sodium, which is causing that dilution. Other end of the spectrum is the hypernatremia, which is the high blood sodium. That's a condition where there's excessive sweating and you may not even have access to the fluid, like you said, in those unfortunate cases where people get lost, go out with these longer races where there's long distances between aid stations. Heck, maybe in an Ironman where there's that. It's not funny, but I guess if you've been through it, you can see the funny side of it when you just drop all your bottles. You've got 3 bottles on your bike, you drop and you go, oh my God, this is terrible. And you go for a long period of time without fluid. Or, like you said, you may have the excess sodium intake. So there's two conditions there. Is that a fair summary of those two conditions?
Yes, yes. And I've been there on the mountain bike and ran out of water 15 kilometers from the next aid station, and it's not fun.
Yeah, and you just go to your happy place, right? And all you can think about is just a big mountain filled with streaming glaciers of water and sticking your head under, and it just becomes your entire existence. But
Yep.
Alan, I think this sets us up nicely to get into the real juicy part of this conversation. Can you tell us about this modeling research that you did and what you found with it?
Yep. So the genesis for this was there's a paper published back in 2008, actually, by the team at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, and there was a model that had been developed actually in clinical nutrition for giving intravenous fluids to people in hospital, in ICU and places like that, by some kidney specialists, Ira Kurtz and Mintry Nguyen at UCLA back in 2003. And it was an update to an existing equation that had been around since like the 50s or 60s, I think, off the top of my head. But these guys had validated this during exercise because obviously the equation was originally designed for urine losses because the people are not exercising and intravenous fluid delivery. But Lindsay Baker and the team at Gatorade actually validated this for oral water and water intake and then sweat, primarily sweat losses, obviously urine as well. Um, and so I was kind of aware of this research, and as I was finishing off my PhD, I was sort of looking at some of my data and thinking about some of the things that were happening and trying to come up with, I said before that there's no real guidelines around sodium replacement. So it was kind of thinking about, well, what could those look like? Like, how could we define that? And so that's when I started to play around with this equation and realized we could flip it around, as I said at the start, and put the sodium at the front of the equation. And then that would tell us, well, actually, how much sodium do we need in a particular circumstance? So the equation is designed to work out the change in blood sodium concentration given the ins and outs of water intake and then sweat and urine losses, ins and outs of sodium intake and then urine and sodium losses. There's a little bit for potassium in there, but it doesn't make a huge difference. And so by flipping that equation around, I could, instead of saying, well, how is the blood sodium going to change? I could say, well, how much sodium do we need to prevent the blood sodium from changing so we don't develop hyper or hyponatremia? And so that's kind of how the model came about. And then I sort of modeled it around different kind of hypothetical scenarios for athletes across a range. We did, a soccer match to look at the team sport end, and then right up to sort of the ultra endurance side of things. And I think what's interesting coming of that, we said before that, if you don't drink anything during exercise, your blood sodium goes up. If you drink too much during exercise, your blood sodium goes down, and that's the hypernatremia. But the question is, well, at some point, it's got to stop going up and start going down. Where's the tipping point? And this equation starts to model theoretically where that tipping point is. And so that gives you a basis to then go out and test it. And I know there's a PhD student over in the UK that's doing exactly that at the moment. So the tipping point does vary a little bit depending on how salty your sweat is, but not dramatically. For people with kind of average salty sweat, it's about 70%. In other words, once you start replacing more than about 70% of the water that you've lost during exercise, then your blood sodium will start to go down if you're not taking any sodium in. Conversely, if you are replacing less than 70% of the fluid that you're losing during exercise, your blood sodium is going to go up even if you don't take any sodium in. And so that gives us a point to say, okay, well, when do we actually need to start considering supplementing or replacing sodium during exercise? And so it seems to be, no one's advocating 100% or more replacement of water. So leave that aside. It's in that kind of 70 to 100% replacement. And so then I take that research and think practically, well, what are the scenarios in the real world where you would want to slash or actually it's possible to replace between 70 and 100% of those fluid losses. And generally that's going to be the ultra endurance events. The longer they are, the more that comes into play. As a general rule, you probably have to be losing at least 5 liters of sweat over the entire event. But the more you lose, the more important that starts to become.
So let's just summarize, because I know the first time I went through this, I had to sit down and look at it a few times, Alan. So let's go through so the listeners can wrap
Yeah.
this around. We're all in agreement, first and foremost, you don't want to replace more than 100% of your losses. So understanding what your losses are in the first place, and like you and I both know, testing that in different conditions, different environmental conditions, heat conditions, different training modalities. Very, very important for any athletes listening to this. Understand what your sweat losses are as a foundation to get this right. And you don't want to replace 100%, because like we spoke about earlier, if you're doing that without the adequate sodium, you can create the situation where we get the hyponatremia, which for all the reasons Alan said is not good. So that's
And there are no
first and
benefits.
foremost.
There are no benefits to replacing that much as well. We don't need to replace all of it from a performance point of view.
And you're going to have a very sloshy belly for you and
Yes.
I, Alan, and all the athletes listening to that. It's not a fun time running
No.
around, cycling, doing swimming, whatever you're doing with a belly full of water sloshing around. Not fun time at all. So then we agree, don't have to replace 100%. But now we're saying, okay, if you're in a position where your gut can tolerate it and you can do it for the duration of whatever this event, you're replacing greater than 70% of the fluid that you're losing in the sweat, that in turn will likely cause your blood sodium to come down. And
Yes.
therefore, it's a smart idea to then include with the fluid or the water that you're consuming some sodium to keep that stable. And if you're in the position where, hey, you cannot replace 70% of those losses, you cannot physically drink 70% of the losses, that will in turn cause your blood sodium to go up. And is it then favorable to have less sodium and just focus on the water? Is that a fair assessment, Alan?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's necessarily saying in that last scenario don't have any sodium, but it's probably saying you don't need to go out and quantify how much sodium you're losing and try to replace a specific amount. Like if you have a little bit more and that encourages you to drink more, then in that scenario where you're only replacing 30%, that's probably not a bad thing necessarily, but it's more a behavioral, it's what it tastes like rather than being scientific about sodium replacement per se. Yeah, and I guess the final thing there are situations where maybe you can replace more than 70% of your fluid losses, but you don't need to because the event is too short for that to become an issue. So again, coming back to what I was saying before, like if you lose less than sort of 4 to 5 liters of sweat over the entire event, so sweat rate times the number of hours that you're exercising for, um, then you probably don't need to drink that much, even if you could, and therefore you don't need the sodium as well.
Can you expand on that a little bit, Alan? I'd love you to talk about your 5 hour research paper there. So, are you saying that time is a big consideration here because the amount that you'll sweat in that time may or may not be significant enough to impact this physiological system enough to have a real impact on your performance? Is that what we're saying?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you can imagine, maybe let's just use running as an easy example. So you go out and do a half-hour run and your sweat rate is 1 liter per hour, but you've only run for half an hour. So you've lost half a liter of sweat. Now that's going to be, for most people, considerably less than 2% of their body weight. And so performance is not adversely affected. So you would argue in that situation, you don't need to drink anything during that event, the half-hour run. So if you rock up to park run on a Saturday morning, you probably don't need to drink during your 5K run, yeah, unless it's 45 degrees or something like that. So in those situations, the required fluid replacement is literally 0%. Now, imagine you then run for an hour at a liter an hour. You're going to lose a liter or 1 kilo of body weight if you don't do anything. Maybe you need to start replacing a bit of fluid. But to come in within the 2%, it's not going to be a big amount that you need to replace. It's probably only, a few hundred mils or something. So it might only be 20 or 30% replacement. But now imagine you're running for 10 hours at losing a liter an hour of sweat. You're going to lose 10 liters or 10 kilos. Now that's, well, it depends on what your starting body weight is, but that's going to be a big percentage body weight loss if you do nothing. And so you're going to need to replace a much greater percentage of that 1 liter an hour that you're losing to still finish the event within that 2% body weight loss. Because the 2% body weight loss doesn't matter whether the event goes for 10 minutes or 10 hours or 10 days, 2% of body weight is still 2% of body weight. That's kind of a fixed number. But the amount that you're losing, whether it's over half an hour or 1 hour or 10 hours or 10 days, obviously increases with duration and sweat rate, the combination of those two. And so the percentage of that you're going to have to put back in to stay within that 2% body weight loss is going to increase as time goes on.
So, just based on what you've said, then, Alan, you could theoretically say, let's graph this. If we were to graph your risk of having a monumental bonk in a terrible time, if you've got all your fueling strategies, if we're just focusing on hydration here, your risk of having a terrible time at one of these races, could we then theoretically model that based on, hey, how much you're actually sweating and how long are you going for? That could give us a decent idea about how risky that event could be for you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I have graphed that. And so, it starts off by going up pretty quickly. and then it gets up, sort of crosses that 70% line that we talked about for sodium replacement, heads up to about 90% at maybe 6, 7 liters of sweat loss. It'll vary a bit depending on your body weight. Um, and then kind of doesn't flatline, but it approaches flatline, and it never completely approaches 100% because obviously you can always lose some body weight and come in within 2% body weight loss. But it is that kind of curve that goes up really quickly and then gets flatter and flatter as time goes on.
Yeah. So where does sweat testing fit into this, Alan? Where do
Yep.
you sit with it? Is it worth doing? Is it not worth doing? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so just to explain if people aren't familiar, there's two parts or two potential parts to sweat testing. One is the sweat rate, so actually measuring the fluid loss from sweat testing, so measuring your weight usually before and after. There are now actually predictive models that you can go online and look at to predict what that might be in different scenarios, which is really helpful, particularly if you're training, for example, here in the winter to go and do an event on the other side of the world in summer. You can't actually replicate those conditions in training. But the other part that I think is more what you're alluding to is the sweat sodium testing. So actually measuring the concentration of sodium in your sweat. So as a general rule, and I guess a lot of this modeling for me was to try and work out the answer to this question was like, who actually even needs to bother with sweat sodium testing in the first place? And from all of that modeling, I think my conclusion is basically, if you're doing events that are less than 4 hours, if you're never exercising more than 4 hours, you probably don't need sweat sodium testing at all. So that eliminates probably 80% of the sports on the planet, possibly even more, that just don't need to do sweat sodium testing. It's when you go longer than that that it may start to become relevant. The longer you are, probably the more relevant it becomes.
And if we're bringing that back in, let's just say we've got these Ironmen or women with the ultra endurance crowd. We've got the BMX guys that can go up to 24 hours. If they go, hey, you know what, Alan, I'm in that crowd. How do I then take everything we just spoke about? I've measured my sweat losses. I've got this sweat test here that says, let's for an easy number, 1,000 milligrams, and I'm losing a liter per hour. How do I then go about what I need to drink in this event that say goes for 10 hours or so? What do they even do?
Yeah. So I like to look at this through a practical lens. So when we're thinking about planning for an event, there's how much water am I losing? How much water do I need? And how much fluid have I got available to me? We talked about before running out of fluid mid-race, and there's nothing worse than that happening. And so I guess the way I tend to see it is, and you've also got to add carbohydrate into the mix because often the fluid is a source of carbohydrate for these events as well. So the way I tend to look at it is, you're going to have an idea of what your sweat losses are, and therefore how much fluid you're going to need. There's some maths involved in that, just in terms of how much you need to drink. We just talked about that before with that graph. Um, but I would look at, okay, well, what's the lowest sweat rate I would anticipate for my event? Because that's probably, I know I'm probably going to need to drink at least that much during my event per hour. And so that's an amount that you can kind of quarantine off as a carbohydrate drink because you don't want to be in a situation where you start drinking more when it gets hotter or less when it gets cooler and your carbohydrate starts going up and down all over the place because you want that to be consistent. So I tend to use, well, what's the minimum fluid I need for carbohydrate? What's the maximum, like the worst case scenario? So my worst case scenario might be, I need 1,200 mils an hour of fluid, for example, but the lowest is 300. So 300 mils an hour I can dedicate to carbs. Anywhere between 300 and 1,200, I don't know because each day is going to be different where I'm going to fit on that. But I know that worst case scenario, I might need 1,200. So I want to make sure I can access 1,200 mils an hour of fluid should the need arise. It may not, but it might. And then how do I decide where to slide up and down between 300 and 1,200? Well, that's where thirst comes in as a feedback mechanism. So if I'm thirsty, I probably need to go higher. If I'm really not thirsty, probably I'm doing okay, or maybe need to go towards the lower end. And so at some stage, I think thirst needs to come into this. I talked about before the polarization, the drink to thirst versus drinking a set amount of fluid, no matter what, has been one of those big polarizations in sports nutrition. And for me, it's a bit of a misnomer because drink to thirst can exist within upper and lower boundaries to kind of guide you. And the upper boundary is not necessarily about I have to drink this much. It's about how much fluid do I need should thirst tell me to drink that much. Because as I said before, like drink to thirst is fine, but if you don't have any fluid, you can't drink to thirst. So I think just that the message of drink to thirst at its most extreme is way too simplistic.
And Alan, just to clarify, with that scenario, if they come back and they say, "Hey, you know what, I've measured my per hour sweat losses. It's 1,000 mils, 1 liter. My sodium sweat losses per hour, let's say 1,000 milligrams. If the goal then, let's say if we go back to that 70%, I want to aim to hit that. Do they then translate that to the sodium as well and go, if I'm replacing 70% fluid, is it a 1-to-1? Do we do 70% sodium
It's
as
not,
well?
unfortunately. So that equation that I used in the modeling, unfortunately, it's not a basic equation. That's what I was kind of looking for, was like, what is this easy number I can take and give to people and say, just do this? Unfortunately, the relationship between the two is not that simple. So in that paper, there's a table that sort of describes how much sodium do you need to replace. So, for example, when you hit about 70%, for the person with the average kind of sodium, you're only replacing about 15% of your sodium losses. But once you start to replace more than like 90% of your fluid losses, that goes up to like 60 to 75% of your sodium losses that you're then replacing. Unfortunately, it's not this nice, perfect linear relationship where you can say, just halve your sweat sodium concentration and do that, or just 70% equals 30% or whatever. Unfortunately, it'd be great if it was a perfect easy relationship like that, but it's not.
And so, taking that info, like you alluded to there, Alan, we've got this camp, drink to thirst. We've got the extremely measured, which is probably promoted more by the companies that say, "Hey, go get this sweat sodium testing. Send us the exact milligrams of sodium you're losing. We'll come up with your completely individualized thing. We'll send you out all these dissolvable tablets, and every hour you can make sure you can replace 1-to-1 of both losses." Based on what we're saying, that's probably not required, nor is it ideal. We're somewhere on this sliding scale, like you said. Okay, drink to thirst. We need to be in tune with our body, but we need to drink to thirst within these set parameters that we know work within our physiology. So for this example, we've got 1 liter loss per hour of fluid. So we can set up, okay, worst case scenario, we need access to 1 liter of fluid every hour. What we should be aiming for, maybe around this 700 if we're aiming for the 70%. But it's okay if we fall behind, if it gets cooler, there's going to be changes throughout. So now we've got a sliding scale, let's say 500 to 1,000 mils per hour. And then we're looking at our sodium and we're going, look, you know what? We don't need to do the 1-to-1. Maybe we apply this sliding scale as well, where we go right from 15% to 75% based on me staying in tune with my body, if I'm feeling good, if we're moving. Is that where we're at when it comes to the hydration and electrolyte, if we're trying to put a best case scenario on it?
Yeah, pretty much at the moment. What I'm doing actually over this summer is building a little calculator that will do those calculations, because, as I said, then it's not kind of a simple rule of thumb that you can just apply, and then making that available to practitioners. So the idea will be that practitioners can then actually use that calculator to then say, okay, well, in this scenario, this is how much sodium you need, kind of thing. But it's not quite there yet. But yeah, that's the plan sort of moving forward. But it's a tricky. I mean, we can go through an example just to sort of demonstrate it in a minute. But yeah, because that relationship is not straightforward, I think where I've sort of come to is there's sort of like a rule of thumb in terms of just like how much sodium, or when do you need to start worrying about it. As I said, if the event is over 4 hours, maybe worry about it. If your sweat rate is less than 1.8 liters an hour, worry, and your event's over 4 hours, um, and you're able to replace more than 70% of your fluid losses. They're probably the three criteria I tend to put around it.
Perfect. Now we'll come to this little thought experiment, which will hopefully give a lot more clarity and put this in a real world. But just before that, last question, Alan, and I think this is really pertinent too, because again, there's so many options when it comes to replacing sodium. You go into a shop, you've got dissolvable tablets, you've got chews, you've got capsules. A lot of people say, hey, just grab the old salt shaker and get the real, or even better, get it in your food. And then you're sitting there as the consumer going, man, I don't even know how much to replace, let alone which way is the best way to do this. Do you have any insight there? Is there any difference, Alan? Is there a better modality to get your salt in?
Modality wise, there hasn't been any research. I think modality wise, I wouldn't expect it to be massively different. It is something I'd like to look at in the future is capsules versus fluids, for example. Um, for all the negative talk about capsules, because you end up taking too much sodium. Well, that's only if you take too many capsules. And I think in some cases, capsules can be an easy way to get a specific amount that you know what you're actually getting. So I'm not necessarily against capsules. I'm probably against too many capsules. Um, so in terms of the form, whether it's in food, fluid, capsules, tablets, whatever, I don't think we know the answer, but I suspect probably it doesn't make a difference. The final question then is the form of sodium rather than the form that of food that it's in. So most products traditionally have been sodium chloride, which is basically table salt. Increasingly, over the last 10 years, products have moved more towards sodium citrate rather than sodium chloride. And I think that's mostly for taste reasons. The chloride gives it that kind of harsh, seawatery kind of taste. Sodium citrate doesn't taste that harsh. The simple answer there is we don't know. The body tends to regulate sodium and chloride for the most part together. Certainly the sweat glands do. And so if you start to replace the sodium but not the chloride, what happens? Look, I suspect probably not much. We haven't done that research, but the fact that we're not having this epidemic of people running into problems now, we're using all this sodium citrate and sodium instead of sodium chloride, suggests to me that if there is a difference, it's probably pretty small.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that, Alan. Thank you so much for clearing that up. I think let's just stamp this down. Let's do this little thought experiment because I think this will really highlight the point that you're trying to get across here. So, if I were to ask you, how would you advise the hydration and electrolyte strategy of a recreational 4 hour, 30-minute marathon runner versus an elite sub 230 marathon runner? How would you go about that?
Yeah, good question. So firstly, if we start off with the 4:30 runner, and I've modeled this, most marathons are running coolish conditions, usually early in the morning as well. So 15 degrees, and I've used the sort of the generic 70 kilo athlete here just to keep them the same in both, mostly sunny conditions. So a 4:30 marathon runner, 70 kilos, 15 degrees, you would expect a sweat rate of about 765 mils per hour if you plug that into a model online, and that is free and publicly available, that model. Sweatratecalculator.com if anyone wants to check it out. Um, okay, so let's say we want to aim to finish the race with a 1.8% body mass loss, so within that 2%. So to do that, you would need 485 mils an hour of fluid to come in within that 1.8% body mass loss from 70 kilos at the start. 485 mils an hour is 63% of the sweat rate. So it's 63% fluid replacement. So that's kind of below that 70% we talked about before. If someone has sort of an average sweat sodium concentration, so around 1200 milligrams per liter, they're losing about 920 milligrams of sodium per hour that they're running. So, do they need any sodium to maintain a stable blood sodium concentration? Well, no, they don't. At that level, you plug it into the equation. No, you don't need any. You actually get a negative value, but that just means your blood sodium's going up no matter what you do. Um, if we were to change from the 1.8% body mass loss target to something that was a bit more aggressive hydration wise, so say from 1.8 to 1.2%, then you're replacing more of the fluid loss. And yes, then if you plug that back into the equation, you do need some sodium to maintain stable blood sodium. It's not a huge amount though. It's like 300 milligrams an hour, which is about 32% of your sodium losses being replaced. So that's the 4 hour 30 marathon runner. If we look at the elite 2.5 hour marathon runner, same temperature, same body weight, but just shorter finish time, we're now looking at a much higher sweat rate. So instead of 765 mils an hour, these guys would be going at 1875 mils an hour. And that's simply because they're just burning more calories per minute of the 42 Ks that they're running. So they're producing more heat, sweating more. So we aim again for the same 1.8% body mass loss. They're now replacing 71% of their fluid to achieve that, which is 1335 mils an hour. Now, this is where you get some of the practical real world stuff coming in because yes, theoretically you'd want them to drink 1335 mils an hour, but I don't know many 2.5 hour marathon runners that could actually access drink and successfully swallow that amount of fluid per hour of their race. That would be a very tough ask. So I think in reality, that just means that they're going to lose more than 1.8% of their body mass. They're going to be into the twos, whether they like it or not, but it's the same for everyone. Um, Again, using the same sweat sodium concentration, but obviously much higher sweat rate now, they're now losing 2,250 milligrams per hour of sodium. So, do they need any sodium to maintain a stable blood sodium? They're now losing, was it more than double the amount of sodium that the first situation was per hour? But actually, they don't need to replace the sodium. So, why not? Well, it's because the event is shorter. You're now taking 2 hours 20 instead of 4 hours 30. So, you don't actually need to replace any sodium because you're going to finish the race before you can turn over water enough to actually dilute that blood sodium concentration. So in that case, you don't really need to take in a specific amount of sodium, at least from a blood sodium point of view either. Now, if you did like an elite versus recreational comparison of 100 kilometer trail ultra or something, that would be a different scenario. But certainly for a marathon, you don't see differences there. As I said, the reality is that the elite runner's not going to drink that much anyway, which again reduces the need for sodium even further.
And that's a great summary. And just on that point, Alan, because we do have a lot of ultra endurance guys that are listening to this, when it comes down, and we won't need to model the 100K, but really the big points that come across is what's the intensity that you're doing this at? How long are you doing it? Are you physically going to lose that much sweat that it's going to make an impact? Again, 2 hours, yeah, they might have to be, and in theory, they should replace, but in 2 hours, they're not going to get in a position where it's really bad. Compare that to the 100 kilometer race, which can take some people up to 24 hours. Yeah, that's a lot of opportunity for your body to lose that fluid. You need to think about it a bit more. Does that then set us up and then we can pretty confidently say, if you thought hydration and electrolyte strategy were pretty individual before, now I hope you think that it's really, really individual.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe the final thing I'll leave people on, and it's probably the thing I get asked a lot is if we use those examples, the elite marathon runner, they're losing over 2,000 milligrams per hour of sodium. So people are saying, well, this person's losing a lot of sodium, but you're telling me they don't need to replace any sodium. How can that be possible? And this is the difference between losing sodium from the body and the blood sodium concentration, how salty the blood is. So you're in a situation where you're losing a lot of sodium, but your blood is becoming saltier during exercise. So now you've got to make a decision. You can't do both things at the same time. What's more important? Is it the blood sodium concentration or is it the total amount of sodium in your body that's important? So far, we don't have any evidence that the amount of sodium in the body, certainly at levels that people can actually achieve in the real world during exercise, is going to make a difference until the point probably where the other requires you to replace sodium anyway. And so, where you've got this conflict is generally those shorter, high intensity events. But for the ultra stuff, these things become more in sync anyway. And if you're in that situation where your blood sodium is going up, but the amount of sodium in your body is going down, well, the solution there is to drink more because then that's going to make the blood sodium come down as well, and then you can justify the sodium intake. Um, but I guess the final thing to leave people on, as you said, there's a lot of sort of complicated maths involved here, is probably if you don't take anything else away from this, is until you replace more than 70% of your water losses, you don't need sodium from a physiological point of view, but if it makes the fluid taste better and encourages you to drink more, and that's a good thing for you, then fine. And if you are replacing it from a physiological point of view, 70% fluid loss, probably 15, 20% replacement, up to, 90% fluid replacement, maybe think about sort of 60 to 75% sodium replacement. Um, that's not perfect maths, but it's probably a reasonable ballpark that will serve most people pretty well.
Excellent. And just a summary from my end, Alan, we're saying everyday hydration, pretty complicated, even though it seems very, very simple. It's not. Assessing your weight and thirst is probably a good way day to day to get by on that. If you're an active person, then being aware of what your sweat rate is probably pretty important when it comes to all of this. That's probably your baseline. Sweat testing, maybe not as relevant until you get into the longer and the more high intensity events, such as your ultra endurance, your 24-hour BMX, your Ironman, things like that. the drink to thirst versus the extremely measured, strict camp, you need to float somewhere in the middle. Probably a drink to thirst within your physiological limits that are set by your body. Just be flexible in there and understand that conditions change, your requirements, the intensity of different stages during the race or event that you're doing will probably change your requirements. You're going to swap between this high sodium, low sodium, depending what goes on, and you want to try and find this nice little balance. And if you want to get a good idea of it, like you said, you can look up your modeling research, take those equations. And I think you and I probably both agree, Alan, where if you want to figure out what works, get these numbers and go out there and test them. Test them well before you get out there and do your event. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that pretty much nails it.
Alan, I have two questions that I ask everyone that comes on the podcast, and I purposely didn't put them in your question notes. So I hope you don't mind me asking them. But
That's fine.
question number one, what is your definition of performance?
Well, obviously, it's going to be different things to different people, depending on what it is that you do. It could be performance in work, it could be performance at home with the family, it could be performance in sport. And so I guess for a lot of people, it's having expectations and being able to meet those expectations, I think, to a degree, because, performance for the 65-year-old marathon runner is going to be different to the Olympic marathon runner, but it doesn't mean it's not performance, it's performance to them. So it's to the standards that they set for themselves, I suppose.
That's phenomenal. Very last one, Alan. What does performance mean to you?
I think probably the same. I think that's probably how I would tend to think about it. I mean, you've got a whole bunch of elite athletes. Performance can be medals and trophies and records and all of that kind of stuff. But for the rest of us out there, performance is what we make of it. It's what we set that standard for ourselves and go out there and try to achieve it. And for some people, that's just to finish an event. For some people, that's to get a particular time, and for some people, it's to win cash and prize money. So yeah, I think performance is very much in our own mind of what it is. And I think for me, that's definitely the same as well. And again, I think that's not just in sport, but in life generally.
That's amazing. All right. Dr. Alan McCubbin, I'm sure there's lots of people listening to this and they'll get to the end of that and they'll go, oh my God, I've looked at these mathematical models. I can't do this. I didn't even pass grade 10 math. So there's no way I'm doing it. I don't even know how to use a calculator. And they're going to go, I need to get in contact with Alan. What's the best way for them to get in contact? Is there social media? Is there email? Is there any other way for them to contact you? Let them know.
Yep. So probably the easiest at the moment would be so my own podcast, Fueling Endurance. So there's an Instagram page for that. Um, we're pretty active in terms of messaging anyone who contacts us through that. So that's probably the best place to start. My own personal website, nextlevelnutrition.com.au, or fuelingendurance.com. There's a contact page through there. If it's more on the research side, ResearchGate is pretty easy to find research papers and things like that. Or if you just Google my name and Monash University, you'll find contact details and things. Universities are pretty good at giving away your contact details, whether you like it or not. So if you go through there, you'll find my Monash Uni email pretty easily.
All right. Alan, thank you so much for that. Again, thank you so much for all the work you do. I've learned so much. It's helped me so much in my practice, and I'm sure many, many other practitioners in the same boat. So thanks so much for taking the time.
No problems. Thanks for having me.